Large-scale changes have dramatically impacted the way we work, and this is likely not going to go away. Transformation is happening all around us, and we have two options for responding. One, we can adapt, or two, we can become obsolete. If you're looking to adapt, you can start with the realization that every large-scale transformation presents a huge opportunity for challenging our assumptions and rethinking the way we do things, hopefully for the better. This video is from a panel event hosted by myself, the founder of Led2Win, and my colleague, Vish Nambiar. Without further ado, we will get the video started, but I would just like to provide you with a note. We started the recording a little late, so unfortunately a small segment of Dr. Hilgard's introduction was cut out. Let's get started.
In the process, it sort of changed me and changed the direction of my career. So I've been pretty much doing leadership and change work kind of ever since. And I have my leadership and organization development business for the past 11 years.
Thank you. I think we will go next to Dr. Jose.
There, and you can just call me Erwin. It's really weird to be called that, but I appreciate it. I started out as a psychologist. I am a psychologist at heart. I went to school to be a psychologist, and I became a organizational psychologist. Did my whole PhD thing maybe about 7 years ago now. So I still remember very much so, like being in your seats and being in these positions, and I went out into the world thinking that I was going to research organizations. And so I started with the Department of Defense, researching cyber defense soldiers. If you guys ever heard of the ASVAB or anything like that, or mental acuity test, I was developing cognitive test and personality test for the Department of Defense for cybersecurity. I then was just sort of like, okay, well, this is, behavior and people in one context. It's the military, which is completely different from the corporate world. And so I said, well, let's go find out what's going on in the corporate space. And so then I started researching insurance organizations. And in the same way, I was kind of in the right place at I don't know if it was the right time. I think it was the right time, where I was brought over to start measuring a big change that they were going to essentially change 50% of their workforce. And they wanted to understand how to put a ring fence on this big piece of change from an organizational psychologist perspective. And from there, I got bit by the business bug, where just as a curious person, I wanted to know more about, well, what's this business? Let me get closer to the criterion, closer to the outcome that we're trying to measure. And I fell into what is now global programs, which is large scale corporate insurance. And that's how I ended up here doing large scale transformation, just like someone described. And it's just sort of now putting ring fences and data around what exactly is this change and how are we measuring it financially, and also from things that we as psychologists and people who are interested in adult learning and everything are looking at, like how happy are these individuals with this change? How confident are they before they walk into this change, and how does that impact the outcomes that we're measuring? So that's how I ended up here.
Thanks a lot, Erwin. We'll go to Cheryl now.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Sleva. It's so nice to see all of you and be part of the TC community. I love this question because I'd really probably summarize my career journey as that of going from a pure practitioner in the workplace and, work my way up through the organization to senior leadership to where I am now, which is really a scholar practitioner. And having made that passionate switch, in the not too distant past, I'm just thriving in that. So there's a word to everyone that you can have multiple careers. But from a practitioner perspective, I spent most of my career focused on leading global innovation teams and the development of new and emerging technologies in fintech and insurtech and health tech. And so spent a lot of years at MasterCard, Gemini, in the consulting field. And while I was at MasterCard, launched 3 businesses for them, which I took globally, was part of their transformation journey when they went public. And working in Capgemini, we had a whole practice called business transformation, where we dealt with things like merger integration and downsizing and upsizing and reskilling and all of those things. Just the journey of an organization like MasterCard, which moved from basically I was part of the team that worked directly with the CEO to when the company went public. Before a company goes public, there's this whole process, multi-year change process that they go through. It just was a really exciting time, but you begin to see the hard work of transformation. And I loved every minute of it. And through these experiences over the many years, I really began to see this magic of teams and organizations and the learning dynamics that happen, particularly and cultural change that you need to make both in the companies that I consulted with before, in all those industries, as well as with the big fintech companies that I worked with, and had a lifelong dream of going back and getting my doctorate and studying innovation teams because I worked with them, led them, particularly in high technology areas. I have my undergraduate degree is in computer science, and I got my MBA in strategic management. So the only thing to do was to get my doctorate, right, in organizational learning, because that was just the capstone of the whole thing. But really with the focus on innovation teams, I did my doctoral dissertation on agile transformation. So if you're all familiar with agile technologies, really the organizations that, and many of them are fintech right now and health tech, but it's really, going through this process of adopting a new way of learning, a new way of being, and really studying the changes that are going on with respect to Agile. My current focus, so having built up a very cool consulting practice, is really on helping organizations create strategic roadmaps to navigate the workplace evolution. And so I'm working with a lot of companies right now, but one particular in industrial automation, which for many of you, I don't want to throw all this lingo out there, but the Internet of Things, and really how we're bridging the virtual world, the digital world with the physical world. So much of that is happening. And I continue to advise in the startup community, have a part of a global community of practice on the future of work, and also do some adjunct teaching, particularly in non-traditional settings in the entrepreneurial community. So excited to be here to talk about transformation with all of you.
Thank you, Dr. Sliva or Cheryl, sorry. And
That's okay.
Will go on to Jimit.
I feel, DJ, you should have sent me first. All of these are tough acts to follow. Hey, everyone. So nice to see folks, some familiar faces. Really nice to see everyone. My name is Jimit. I basically graduated from Columbia last semester, so still pretty fresh in the working world in the US, but a quick snapshot of my journey. My journey basically started with around 8 years ago, me dropping out of a master's program in accounting because I realized that wasn't my world. I ended up joining a nonprofit in my city back in India, started working with around 30 different nonprofits in my city, helping them identify how they can maximize their impact. That journey led me to Greece. I spent 2 years in Greece doing what I now realized is organizational development and change management. Greece was still is suffering a massive financial crisis. Our role there was to help young people identify what their skill sets were and how they could implement them in organizations. So we were doing a lot of organizational change management work and helping people develop leadership skills. From there, went on to work in Indonesia for a couple of years, where I tried my hands on teaching. So I was working with young adults and again, helping them identify leadership skills, leadership qualities, what gets people employed, while struggling with those things myself and learning throughout that journey. Finally came back to my country recently in India, where I spent, again, two odd years in a nonprofit, helping the organization build from ground up their systems, their teams in the education sector to make sure that we are able to create, again, the maximum impact with the most valuable, most powerful people across the country. So I've basically across the last 8 years have been lucky enough to work in now US being my fourth country, where I've done work which has been around organizational transformation, change management, talent attraction, talent development, brand management, and so forth. None of these languages I knew as I was doing them because all of that was new for me. As I went through school, I spent my 2 years at Columbia at TC doing my master's in organizational psychology from 2019 to 2021. So basically the very best time that you could have come here to do the master's. You came here and everything went virtual. I remember we were in Professor Jose's class at the time when we had to go virtual, and we were all thinking, oh, this is going to go away. But we ended up spending most of our master's 1.5 years doing it virtually. And then eventually I finished my master's earlier this year. I joined a strategic consulting firm called Co-Collective. I had been a big detractor of consulting firms. I hated consulting firms. I had my mental models against them. And the more I spent time in TC, the more I spent time working with people, actually talking to consultants, I realized this is actually a fascinating world. And I ended up being able to join an organization that works with purpose-led brands and businesses. So what our job right now is to identify how do we help enable organizations to find their calling, find their quest? How do we activate it on a day-to-day basis? How do we make sure that people's lives in those organizations go from being really sucky to amazing? What changes need to happen within the organization to be able to do that? So we get to be in the room to help organizations try and answer those questions and give our insights and thoughts and recommendations. So absolutely something that I have fallen in love with and have been doing for the past 6 months now. And I'm here in front of you. So that's a quick snapshot of my journey.
Wow, thank you all. I am so excited to learn from you. We have so many diverse experiences, so I know this will be a great event. I will pass it to my co-moderator, Vish, who will kick off with the second question, I guess.
Thank you, DJ, and thank you so much to everyone who shared their journeys. And it was really wonderful listening to all of your stories. My first question is to Dr. Hilgard. Could you describe some of the challenges involved in organizational transformation and change management with the employees and the companies that you have worked with?
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying that even though it's challenging, I always see every big change as it's obviously a big opportunity, because when you put the transformation label on something, it means it probably has a big budget. It probably has lots of different work streams. It means there's some investment, some pretty significant investment in the company. And I like to think it's also a chance for employees and teams and leaders and middle managers to get their needs met as well, because there's probably things that they don't like about the status quo. And so in the best world, all those things could come together and we can create something that meets a lot of those different needs. And it's a good opportunity to do so. So I'm sort of looking at this from the angle of what could get in the way of that. And of course, there are things that can. The first is that somewhere in the organization, there's a pretty big incentive not to change. So a most obvious one would be if it's profitable not to change, not to follow the new processes or not to follow something that makes it a better place culturally or a more inclusive place. If there's somehow incentive somewhere, you'll see that cropping up. And so, really in any type of transformation program that doesn't kind of figure that out and name that and figure out how to truly address that, because that in itself needs transforming first. Otherwise, it's not gonna work. If change is only understood by a few people or not the right people, or maybe it's understood by them and they're really good at giving it lip service, but they're not actually championing it and rewarding. Again, it gets back to they might sort of let certain behaviors on a team slip if they're somehow benefiting that team or their incentives or the company. And so it needs to be much more widespread. And I'm a big proponent of really working through the middle layer of the organization. So really, I'm doing a session tomorrow morning, in fact, with a group of mid-level leaders and senior leaders, with really the shift in focus that the senior leaders telling the middle leaders, we are the leadership. So how do we figure this out together? And that's the second one. And then the third one is, my specific passion is really around the skill set and mindset shift that's needed for the future of work, for all the things that the next 10, 20, 100 years are going to be asking for us in the workplace. And really sort of a deficit model that's been set up to look at that as a gap. And so no one wants to be told they have a gap, right? I can go to the gym and they can spend 10 minutes or they can spend a 5-hour assessment telling me how unhealthy I got during the pandemic. It does not motivate me. It doesn't make me want to come back. It makes me want to stay home and do something online and not interact with people. So telling people about their gaps and really making that the focus of the skills portion of transformation, I think is the biggest problem of all. So my research is about the identity shift involved in, so that's the dissertation I did when I was in the ALL program. And I did that dissertation after I'd worked in this field, asking this question to myself of how do people actually change? Because I'd noticed we'd have multi-million-dollar budgets and tons of great training, but people still weren't changing. So what were we doing wrong, right? And so then I got to go to Columbia and think about that for 7 years in TC, and got to that really pulled me in the direction of identity. And so the work I do now is really helping organizations to look at it from a broader human identity perspective, and what incentivizes someone to change, and how do they find a piece of themselves in that new world.
Thank you so much. There was so much in that answer. I guess I firstly appreciated the perspective that you came from, that, like, of course, change is hard. We hear all the time change is hard, but it also presents a lot of opportunity. And I love the way you outlined some of the challenges you faced, and so interested in your work on identity and transformation. So we will go on now to Erwin. I have a question for you. I know that one part of your work is to help enable business growth by equipping the right people with the knowledge and skills to enhance productivity. Can you share some of the benefits of learning and development, as many of the people here will be in the Adult Learning and Leadership program, and how we can use L&D to help businesses achieve their business results?
So in the question you sent to me, there's another part to that around my angle from organizational psychology and how does this apply to this. So I had prepared this answer with that lens.
Sure. Sorry, go ahead. Oh, let me.
Whenever I think about transformation and L&D from an organizational psychologist perspective, it really gets very, and this is a little bit lingo, but it's very industrial psychology. We're looking at this large scale. What exactly are we doing and what are we processing? So Himit and I, we know each other because I teach people analytics at TC for the social organizational psychology department. And what I think is different from how I approach things is that I look at learning and development as sort of a part within a larger system that is measured. And I'll give you 2 examples, and it's related to sort of some of my other work. So in the Department of Defense, what the organization was having a problem with was finding cyber defense soldiers. So these are really highly skilled individuals who are basically hacking networks. The Department of Defense can't keep up with Google. They can't keep up with Facebook. They can't keep up with Amazon. That's sucking all of that the word cyber talent, if you will. So if you remember, there's a big gap on that. So what the Department of Defense decided to do was to build that talent internally. And so their learning and development strategy was to go out there into the army, these hundreds of thousands of soldiers out there, and test them to find proclivity for cyber work. So there's a certain pattern, a personality and sort of cognitive disposition and a specific level of smartness that you have to select for. And so we went out there and we basically canvassed hundreds of thousands of individuals with these psychological tests and found individuals that we believed subsequently to be more likely to successfully pass the training, because training is expensive. And in the Department of Defense, what they wanted to do with their learning and development is make sure that they weren't wasting hundreds of thousands of dollars training these cyber defense soldiers who are only going to subsequently leave and go work for Google. You work for the Army for 1 year and then you get a 400% pay increase and go work for Google. We're like bleeding talent all over the place. So we were trying to find and weed out then who were people who are likely not only to be successful at learning, but would stay with the organization longer. So that's kind of one way that, as an organizational psychologist, looking at learning and development at a different angle, it added a selection component to it, because now we're talking about cognitive selection and selection for training success. In the insurance world, now what we're doing is we're assessing for competence in complex financial systems, okay? Because certain people shouldn't be touching very complex business. And so what we're doing now is we're trying to train for competence, which is a little bit different. And now our assessment isn't necessarily to select for success, it's to select to exclude. And so in the insurance industry, we run things by letters of authority. And underwriters, for example, can only write $50 million worth of limit. And to get more than $50 million worth of limit, you must be this. And that's where that selection strategy for us now starts. And it then bleeds into our learning and development strategy, because then we obviously, one can identify where the gaps are, where we need to fill those gaps, but then also we're able to identify where we can take individuals and pull them into different types of business. So to answer your question, from an organizational psychology perspective, looking at how L&D works, for me, it's where the rubber really hits the road in change. For any change to happen, somebody must learn something. So yeah, that's I think how being from an organizational psychology perspective, it gets very industrial and it's very testing and it's large scale, like test, move, part of the big machine. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I'll pass it to Vish for the next question.
Thank you so much for that response. It was really insightful. And my next question is for Dr. Sliva. When leading transformation or introducing new innovations into an organization, what are some of the most important skills to have? And there's a second part to this question as well, which would just be about the kind of challenges that you deal with to resistance to change.
This is a really excellent question, Vish, and I'm so glad you asked it, because I think it speaks directly to the issues and opportunities and challenges that are facing us as educators, as researchers, as instructors, as thought leaders, as consultants within the world of education, but very much so in business and government, and as we think about the future of work. And I think everyone's talking about that now. We're kind of throwing that term around, but this is largely being shaped by this fourth great industrial revolution, or 4IR as it's known. Back in 2019, there were two colleagues and myself from TC conducted a multi-sector research study with senior executive leaders in business, government, and education. We were very blessed to have access to some real leading edge thinkers. And we published those results in an article in the Human Resource Development International Journal. I'll put the reference in the chat, because we definitely called out the details around skills, which is the question that you asked. But very much around innovation, they're saying that these skill sets, and I'd love to hear, what Erin and Erwin have to say about this as well, because I loved how Erin framed this idea that it's not a skills gap. There's an aspirational element in terms of what we want to move towards as individuals and also organizations. But these 21st century skills are largely what we're looking for innovation as critical elements of success. And there are a number of great references. I put our article in the chat. But what we found in our research, and I continue to stay on top of this, is, some of the best research around skills that we have been able to find in our literature review and ongoing analysis is coming from the practitioner community in terms of speaking and consulting community in terms of speaking around those skills. I particularly have liked the World Economic Forum, their future of work or future of jobs research. And the whole reskilling conversation that's happening around that. There's some great work from Bloomberg. There's, some other great sources as well. But they've been tracking this year over year. And what I've loved to see is the development of that. And so the skills, I would say this collection of skills that are 21st century that map well to innovation sort of thematically come out like this. You've got analytical thinking or critical thinking, creativity, active learning, and engaging in cognitive learning. For example, my study of agile innovation teams, this is an ongoing, it's not even work-based learning, it's learning-based work in terms of iteration and creativity in that. Complex problem solving, critical thinking and analysis, creativity, originality, leadership skills. as we're kind of thinking about, artificial intelligence coming into the mix and a lot of machine learning, what are the unique things that people bring to the table that algorithms can't? The ability to adapt well, this concept of agility, resilience, which I think we've all learned in the COVID crisis, and stress tolerance, and the ability to be flexible and adaptable, and demonstrate good reasoning under different scenarios. So these are the skills I think we look for innovation, but they're very much mapping to 21st century skills. The second part of your question, I think, pertained to some of the challenges associated with transformation that I've seen both in my experience and also in my research. And I'm sure my colleagues would bear witness to this. But I think one of the critical things that I see as a key challenge for organizations is the ability to effectively communicate the vision or the strategy to the people that are being part of this transition. Sometimes these transformation efforts happen with a big bang, but then they kind of fall flat, and people need to see, as they're going through the difficult cycles of change, they need to continually to hear from the leadership and the organization that there's an old adage that says, without vision, the people perish. People need to be connected to that vision and see how they're doing against that vision. So I put communication at the top of the list in terms of challenges. Failing to get buy-in. And I loved how Aaron was talking about that middle level, because that's often where you see the most resistance, at least in my experience as a consultant and a leader, executive leader. You've got to get all levels of the organization bought in. And once they're bought in, you've got to keep them in. I'm sure my colleagues will also agree, culture. There has to be a new organizational culture. I'm seeing this so much in large-scale agile transformations that are falling apart because this culture of agile becomes a team-based culture. And the team has this very strong adaptive culture that's coming against the larger organizational culture. And there's a concept called strategic organizational learning. Dr. Victoria Marsick wrote an excellent book on this with her colleague, Martha Gephardt. And this idea about how organizations go through and learn as an organization. And part of that is embracing this new culture. And doing culture is a very, very hard thing. When I was at MasterCard and we're going public, what a change. And that, our identity is not financial services company, it's technology company. And so how do we get people to embrace that? When you had a lot of former bankers running the halls at MasterCard, now they're like, wow, look what Google's doing. We're going to bring in scooters and pinball machines, and that's going to change the culture. And it certainly had the shock value of that, because believe it or not, that was done. But it took longer to embrace this identity of moving fast and thinking fast. So the culture piece is so key. And many organizations rush through the transformation process. They'll set up an office, a change management office. I see this all the time with Agile. I'm seeing this now with the Internet of Things. And then they think, okay, we're done. We've been doing this for a couple of years. And they fail to provide the adequate support to help the organization and the teams make the turn. So those are the big ones that I would see. And in terms of dealing with resistance to change, because I think that was also part of your question, I think what I've seen in my experience and in my research is that resistance is to be expected. I think sometimes executive leaders are surprised that people are resisting it or shocked or angry about it. And so I think there's an opportunity to get ahead of it and be proactive in terms of communicating it, but also understanding what the root cause of the resistance is, because sometimes it's very legitimate. In fact, often it's very legitimate, particularly with the people in the middle of the organization who are bearing the brunt of this large-scale transformation. And so clearly in the communication and dialogue that should be taking place during large-scale change, a lot can be learned in understanding what the root causes of resistance is. And I think resistance, I think it can be addressed constructively and collaboratively, but I think that it has to be addressed formally. Sometimes it's rumblings or undercurrents of resistance, and it's ignored or dismissed or handled privately. But I think if organizations are going to set the tone that, this is the direction we want to go, we've got to turn the ship around, it's going to take a while, they've got to be able to do that. And the last piece I would say is you can bring some real leaders in the organization at multiple levels, peers to come in and kind of help with and engage with coming against that resistance. So anyway, I'm sorry for the long answer, but it was a multi-part question. So, but I hope that helped.
Yeah, thank you so much. And a lot stuck out to me. I was actually making some connections from what Erwin said as well, thinking about his time with the Department of Defense. And I think one thing that stood out to me culturally working HR for an investment bank is that our competitors are now a lot of these tech companies, and we really have to think about our identity and how we remain competitive if we're fighting for the same talent. And one that also stuck out from what Erwin said about fighting for talent, with the Department of Defense and Google, et cetera. So the next question I have is for Jimit, and for Jimit, the question is, what are some of the decisions that you find yourself constantly making in your role? What are some of the resources that you use to make them? And can you talk about some of the ways that your time at TC has enhanced your career?
Yep, definitely. Thanks so much for that, DJ. Just one piece that I do want to connect to what Cheryl said at the end. Dr. Warnerberg always used to tell us resistance is so much better than apathy, because resistance means people care and apathy is much more dangerous. So definitely it got me reminded of that. So thanks so much for sharing that, Cheryl. The decisions that I need to make every day are all fun decisions. So they are at different levels. So we work with organizations, and organizations usually come to us with, let's say, a challenge or a problem statement, right? Yeah, like how we've acquired all of these organizations across all of these different countries. How do we bring them under a single cultural umbrella? Or we want to increase access to something globally that has never been done before. What does it mean for our people, for our teams? So these are problems which have very far-reaching impacts. So one of the first decisions that we have to make on a daily basis is, how do we break the bad news to them gently? Because a lot of times what this means is organizations usually don't realize how much work needs to go into every single of these problem statements across every single level of the organization. All the systems are interconnected, and organizations usually haven't thought that deeply enough, which is why they come to us, right, as organizational psychologists, as learning consultants. So one of the metaphors that kind of also reminds me of what my work entails is, it's a real quick story. So there was a guy who was walking by in a forest who saw another guy furiously trying to cut down a tree with a really blunt axe. And he said, "Why don't you sharpen your axe?" And the guy said, "Because I don't have the time." So that's part of what our role is, right? To allow people to help them to pause and sharpen their axe. And that usually, again, comes with resistance, right? People do want to change. People do want to do things quickly, more effectively, more efficiently, hire more people, make more profits. But it's usually very difficult to pause and reflect and then be able to sharpen their axe, so to speak, right? So our decisions have to do with those kinds of challenges. How do we help organizations understand how deep the problems might be? How do we help them identify ways to pause and reflect while still keeping their work going, right? So let's say during the immersion phase, when we go really deep into the organization to try and understand the challenges, the decisions that we have to make are, who are the key stakeholders? Who are the people across all levels that would know what's up, that would be able to allow us to go slightly deeper into what the problem seems to be? Usually we see our clients come to us and say, "Hey, here is a problem statement." But as you dig deeper, you understand that that is not actually the problem statement. It goes much deeper, and you have to go at least 5 layers deeper to identify what the real root cause of the problem is. So during an immersion stage, our decisions will be, who are the key stakeholders? What is the best way to get the best information out of people? How do we engage these people in the conversation? Again, just to connect to what Cheryl was saying earlier, a big piece with buy-in comes in here, right? When people feel engaged in the process of change, and when they feel ownership to the change, they start getting excited about it. So in the immersion stage, it is, who are the people that will be the most influential? Who are the people that are the most connected? Who know what's going on the ground? Who are people that might be the most resistant to a change? How do we get them on board at the start, right? So that goes on in the immersion stage. So as we move from immersion, as we start to understand organizational problems, the next stage is, okay, let's present what we are finding. So there, the pieces of the decisions that come up are, how do we, the biggest challenge that I'm currently facing as someone who just finished school, let's say being 2 years full-time in school and now moving back to the working world, is how do we translate a lot of things that we know, let's say as organizational psychologists in our mind, into normal human language, let's call it, like language that people understand. It's easy for people to get what we are trying to tell them, right? So the decisions are, what frameworks do we want to use to analyze what we've learned? How do we want to present that information? What are the key pieces of information that we want to put out there for our clients to, like, really, what provocative questions do we want to put to our clients that they may not have thought of? At this stage, a lot of times our job becomes, how do we call out the elephant in the room? So when you dig deeper into the challenges, you realize that there are a lot of covert processes that are happening within the organization. Let's say there are ways in which the leadership is showing up and manifesting itself that is having toxic implications on the workplace, or there are multiple subcultures that are cropping up within the organization that are causing like harm to the mission or not allowing people to do their best jobs, or there are people who are not doing their jobs well, or there are managers who are getting away with not treating their people well. So it's also becomes, when we are presenting our findings from these immersions, it's about what frameworks do you use, what do you want to tell them, and how do you call out the good and the bad news, right? Because it's also important, as Dr. Hilgard was saying, that it's not just enough to say, here are your gaps and here is the bad news, but also what are you doing really well and how do we capitalize on that? And then when it comes to the implementation stage, a few decisions that we have to make on a regular basis, excuse me, are, again, how do we identify what are the key goals of what we want to achieve? What is the timeline? How do we get, again, the right people on board? How do we maintain momentum, right? Again, a lot of change efforts, even when you get people super excited at the start, it's very easy for it to fall off the radar. People have their plates full already. I'm sure you have all experienced this in your lives as well, is especially when an organization comes in and says, hey, we are going to completely change the future of work is here. So we are going to change differently. We are going to work differently. We are going to use a whole different technology. And you're like, okay, cool. And then you go back to your own work. So it's very difficult for you to understand how this applies to your world, right? So our decisions are, how do we break it down to, okay, if these are the challenges that we've identified, here are the solutions that we feel will allow us to move the needle forward. How do we allow the right people to understand what does it mean for them? Why is it important for them to do it? And how can they be influential in making that a change that lasts, right? So again, in that implementation phase, a big part of our decisions is, again, identifying who are the key stakeholders, the key influencers, making sure we have the right systems, structures, support processes, goals to enable people to not just be excited, but keep their momentum going and embed those changes in their everyday work, right? And again, in the implementation phase, a few challenges that we usually come across are, leadership is usually very excited to add more things to their plate and to their people's plate, but it's much more difficult to say, okay, we are going to stop doing this. We will deprioritize this. So then again, a tough decision that we have to help them make is, okay, so what are you taking off the table? If you're saying, again, for instance, we are going to work differently with our hybrid teams because we want to change the way the organization shows up in context of the future of work, and we want to give our people more flexibility. So what does it mean for their well-being? What are you willing to take out of their plates? How much more time are you willing to give them for self-care, for example? So those decisions also are like, our job then becomes, how do we present those provocative questions to our clients and help them come up with those answers? So again, it has a lot to do with being able to coach and empathize with clients, working, like implementing all of our EQ and SQ skills that we've been learning, implementing a lot of conflict management skills that we've been learning at school. So those are a few of the decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis. I would say, like, just to reiterate, my personal challenge has been, there's so much useful stuff that we learn at TC. How do you translate that into something that becomes customizable, understandable, usable, right? Like very recently, I used a model from the 1970s, which was exactly applicable to the client's challenge. And we had to understand, how do you make this model, what is the current version of that model, because the idea of that model was right for the client. So it was about understanding how do we translate something that is useful to the clients. So I think I'll also, the second part of the question, I'll try to transition into that. What did TC give me? So in terms of, again, there are three big pieces that come to my mind. It's content, people, and mindset, right? So with content, it's about everything that I've learned. Every single day I get amazed at how useful it is. I was telling someone on this call recently that I go back to my notes on a weekly basis and see, okay, this was the framework. This is how it got implemented in theory. Let's see how this gets worked into the client's world, right? And it's been pretty fascinating for me to see how applicable it is. So when I was in TC and when people would say, okay, this is a scholar practitioner model of teaching, I'd be like, yeah, I don't know what that means. But now as I am bringing that into, when I see that show up in not just my client presentations, but when my client makes a strategy shift and it shows up on their website now, you're like, oh, that's powerful. That's something really strong. So I do feel that I've been amazed by how much TC has contributed to that in terms of content, especially courses in organizational psychology, of course, in adult learning and leadership, in clinical psych as well. I took some courses that I still find valuable models that I take from there and try to implement at the workplace, which has been fascinating. With regards to people, I think I keep telling people that, especially my friends back home, or when people ask me what your experience in TC has been like, I always tell them TC is one of the most nurturing and caring place that I've come across. And it's been really, again, a very surprising revelation for me, because you always feel it. But when you're able to look back at it, it becomes much more relevant and it gets highlighted a lot more. There are people that you meet around here who are always willing to help, who are always supportive, whether it is your professors, people from different offices, people from the cohort in the classroom. People are always trying to look out for each other and support each other, which has been pretty fascinating for me, because I was expecting it to be so much more competitive. And I realized that this is exactly what I needed, because as organizational psychologists, what you need to do is learn how to be the human that is able to empathize and bring people together and have people's backs. And I feel TC taught me that on a very regular basis, so that's been really interesting. And with regards to mindset, of course, without I can't think of TC without the pandemic context, right? So the pandemic itself, being an international, coming here, spending around 6 months in person and then doing 1.5 years online, has been it kind of helped me and a lot of people around me, my cohort, the cohort that came after that, just the ability to say, no matter what happens, we got this, and that's been really interesting to as it plays out, is we were able to navigate some very, very intense times, and not only navigate them, even flourish and thrive in them pretty quickly, within a couple of months, people found their groove, people found how to get their work done, people found how to thrive in their educational context, or I saw people being able to do so many things during the pandemic. So I feel that mindset of we got this, being resilient, being able to thrive in very, very difficult situations. And of course, our program teaches us change management at its core, right? So the change and transformation, I also saw that apply to my personal journey of how I started to learn to change and transform myself throughout that 1.5 year of the pandemic, right? So again, there were some very, very deep personal learnings that I got from TC. Again, places like Odyssey that had been my home for 2 years, ALL, the program directors, all of these people had a huge role to play. But also every single professor, I have to call out Professor Jose here, who was, as I said, one of our professors while we were transitioning from in-person to online learning. I can't even imagine how professors managed to completely change the way they had to teach without any time at all, and we never heard any professor complain or say, hey, this is not going to happen anymore, miss any classes, and still always be there to support you, so all of that, it kind of builds up and it kind of teaches you a lot. So lots of things that TC taught me that I take back with me and I know is part of me now. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jim. One thing that stuck out to me, or one thought that I came back, was a quote I heard some time ago. Nothing is as practical as a good theory. And it's like you take for granted that the theory just doesn't become practical. You actually have to make it practical. And that means oftentimes translating it into language that's understandable. So we'll switch gears now and go into our speed round. So this is intended to be questions that are one or the other, but they're probably both. But we'll have our panelists choose one and say a few words about their choice. So the first question is, what is more important, aligning with an organization's culture or aligning with an organization's mission? And briefly describe your answer. We'll start with Dr. Hilgart.
It's such a hard question. I don't want to be first on that one. I think factually you have to align with the mission because that's how you tap into the logic, but it's not going to work unless you spend more of your effort to shift the culture, because the culture is the real thing. It's what's really happening every day at the water cooler or online or whatever now. But yeah, that's a tough question, but that's my answer.
Erwin?
I'm going to cop out and say I had to agree. I was having the hard thing. It's like, it's definitely not an either or, because if your transformation is not aligned with the organizational mission, I mean, you're just dead in the water. But at the end of the day, when these things go out live, there are the conversations that happen behind closed doors and behind the water coolers, where it's just sort of, this is really where the shift is. And so just to be provocative, I'm going to say, and my final answer is culture. The water cooler thing is so real. It's really tangible. And if they're not feeling what you're talking about in terms of transformation, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Cheryl?
Wow. I have to go on record by saying I think they are totally mutually dependent. But if you made me pick one, I would choose culture. And here's why. The former CEO, well, he's still present CEO, but he's transitioning, Ajay Banga from MasterCard, a genius of a guy and just brilliant in terms of his ability to turn a phrase. And he would always talk about his struggle with he wanted everyone to be on the same page strategically, because what he didn't want to have was what he called 1,000 flowers blooming. If you have 1,000 flowers blooming, you can't gather them and sell them, and you confuse your customers and all of these other things. And so, but even if everyone's not aligned with the mission, you could get lucky. And that as a lot of organizations who have 1,000 flowers blooming do get lucky. So I believe strategically, you need to have everybody on the same page. You need to be working that alignment, especially now in this global environment. But you also need to have different expressions of what that looks like, because there's just so much that different cultures and countries and perspectives bring to the table. But with culture, if you don't have an organization evolve from a cultural perspective, it is the death knell of change efforts. And I have one interesting anecdote on this. When MasterCard was going public, or they went public and they wanted to make sure that they made the turn, and Ajay came in, he noticed that all the executives, he's a brilliant guy, he noticed that all the executives were in different corners of the building or in their own fiefdoms in their regions and countries. And so what he did, and this may seem like it's a very cosmetic thing, because I talked about superficial things that you can do to change culture, but he said, I'm going to create an executive suite, which sounds like some elitist, like horrible thing, but it wasn't. He pulled all the top guys, had them in the center of the headquarters operation with floor to ceiling glass windows. They had to look at each other and bump into each other when they were getting coffee and talk to each other and collaborate. They couldn't retreat into their dens, in different parts of the organization. And so he did this one thing in terms of changing the tone at the top and forcing those men and women to work together, and by putting them together in the same place. And magical things started to trickle down to the organization. So I choose culture. If you put a gun to my head, I would say culture.
Thank you for that. I'm very curious now, because I know we're all living in a pandemic world. Like, what his answer would have been if they were all working virtually? I'll pass it to Jim to answer this question.
Yeah, thanks so much, DJ. I almost want to, I have a feeling that all these questions are meant to like trap us, and then you will like just capture that part of the clip and circulate it. Yeah, I'm going to go the other way around and say if I had to choose one, of course they're absolutely dependent. If I had to choose one, I would rather be in a place where people are first aligned to the direction and then have a common culture than have a common culture but not have an alignment in direction. Because I feel that ideally the culture should come out of the vision and the mission and where we want to go, and like the culture then becomes the enabling, empowering element to it. Because again, I feel it's very personal because I've been part of organizations or seen organizations in the past who've had amazing cultures, but that was it. Like there was no alignment of where the organization wanted to move. People had different motives, different intentions, and then there was so much resilience and resistance to changing and moving in a certain direction, which is why I feel I would want to be in an organization where I have alignment to the mission with the caveat that culture has to follow immediately after.
Perfect. Thank you all for that. The second speed round question is, if you had to describe one characteristic every leader should strive to embody, what would it be and why? And I guess we can start again with Erin, if that's okay.
Yeah, I would say self-leadership, because from that you can do it, I get away with then layering in that makes you agile. It makes you self-aware enough to take feedback and adapt yourself. You can be agile. So I can, by saying self-management, self-leadership, you can add a lot of things in there that you'd be able to do sort of as a result. And it keeps you in that cycle of continuous learning too.
That's a bonus. That's a bonus answer. Go to you, Erwin.
I do like that answer. I do have to say, I'm not going to repeat it. I'm not going to copy you again this time, but I do totally agree that it's kind of like the idea of it's like, put your own mask on before you take care of someone else's mask, and don't try to lead me if you can't lead yourself. And it's just that really spreads, really resonates with me. But anyways, if I were to have to think of another one, I would just be really, really simple about it and just say, just niceness. I think leadership and leading and change really does require somebody who's capable of just really basic niceness. It's sort of like that book, I think it's called All I Ever Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Very simple. Leaders need to be nice, like easy peasy.
Go ahead, Cheryl. Thank you for that answer.
I love that book, by the way, Erwin. That was a favorite of mine. And I'm going to build on nice, but this is my number one: authenticity. I think that authenticity is, whether it's authentically good or authentically bad, I think, we often forget that part and parcel to leadership is followership. And, there are two questions that team members are always grappling with when they think about their leaders. Can the leader take us where we need to go? And will they care about us along the way? And so to the extent that you're not authentic, if people don't know what to expect of you, if there's mystery, we can call it politics, we can call it microaggression, we can call lots of different elements of it in terms of what corresponds. But as a leader, your followers need to know who you are and what you expect and what you're about, and be confident that you have the capacity to take them where they need to go, or you be vulnerable enough to get them together to figure that out. But it gets back to what Erwin was saying about kindness. I think that's so important. People need to be cared about, and that can look differently based on different personalities. But authenticity is my number one.
Thanks. Pass to Jimmy.
Yep, I'm fully going to steal Erwin's answer and say kindness is absolutely at the top. And especially, I feel, especially because, again, I'm thinking about my personal experience of having been led and leading people. I feel like when I've had managers who've been kind, everything else has usually fallen into place. So like the word that came to my mind was empathy, right? So the skill that I would want to learn as a leader and constantly learn is empathy, especially right now, because most of us are living in our isolated 2D worlds. It's become so important for our leaders to be able to understand what people are going through. How do we support them in a context that is new to us and them both as leaders? So I feel empathy is a big, huge, like, game changer almost right now for leaders to learn and have. I'm seeing that again constantly with the teams that I'm working with, the clients that I'm seeing are being successful. Most of the times, what the leaders are doing is going from the proverbial desk to desk and finding out what people are feeling, how are they doing, what do they need, and it's almost as simple as that. And as the more you get to know what your people need, the more you're able to be the right leader for them. So I feel empathy, kindness would be definitely at the top.
Thank you. And our final speed round question, and I don't know if this one will be as controversial, but I would love to hear the answer and some of the reasons why. But there's a quote by an entrepreneur, Gary Tan. It says, "At every job, you should either learn or earn. Either is fine, both is best. But if it's neither, then you should probably quit." So in your opinion, which is more important, particularly when you're early in your career, to learn or to earn? And I'll start with Aaron.
Well, so at a macro level, I have to say learn, right? I did my doctorate in adult learning and leadership. So for sure that I didn't do it in something more profitable. But I would say on a step-by-step level, I think the earn thing is important, because if it's just for a couple of years and you're soaking some stuff in, there's certainly been times in my career where I did something that I was learning a ton, and it wasn't as valued by the organization as I learned from it, then that's fine. But if you're staying around and making kind of a career out of it, you're there long enough that it sort of is really defining your career, don't stay there if you're not earning. So a classic example is I do see organizations where internal change is not valued. And I've been close with internal change leaders who say our CEO literally stood up and said, we don't value, they don't like change. This is something they sort of have to do. And it was beyond just, it was something embedded in the culture. So is that the place to build your career? For a couple of years to get some great learning, okay, but don't stick around, because if it's not valued as much as product development or other things, then it's time to also move.
Oh, thank you for that. Go to Erwin.
Yeah, I'm obviously a learner. That's probably something we all have in common here, and why we are so into continued education and even this topic. So it is a time thing. And I swear, I'm not copying you, but every single time, you get this answer, it kind of frames the way I think also. But if you're early in your career, yeah, I would imagine that learning is pretty critical. But at the same time, there is a reality to it. And sometimes you just got to get yours, make sure you're getting paid and know that this is a transaction, and you need to make sure that you're getting paid. I'm gonna go with that, because it's important nowadays for sure.
Thank you for that, Cheryl.
I'm doubling down on learning, but I also say that, because I've been an innovator, but all my heroes are innovators, and I find that the best learners are often the best earners, right? Thomas Edison learned 99 ways not to make a light bulb. But that invention, has changed humanity, and, for better or for worse, in different ways. And I think this idea of, you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. And so I think they go hand in hand.
Thank you. Jimmy?
Yep, I'm going to put my neck out again. So apart from the idea that for some people, it actually may not be a choice, depending on your financial situation, you might have to choose earn, of course. What I'm realizing is the choice is a difficult one, because taking up roles where you're not earning, you have to be really careful about, one, is the organization really conscious about your learning? Not the consequential learning that happens just by the way because you're working there. If you are deciding to go to work for an organization where you're not getting paid, you should do your due diligence and say, are you actually going to put effort into my learning? And I feel the second piece that, again, I've experienced personally is when you spend time working and not earning, it becomes difficult for you to identify what your self-worth is. And it's really important to know what your self-worth is. We have a lot of value to add to the workplace, and it's important to know what that value is. And the more time you spend working without earning your due, even if you're learning a lot, I feel that there is a cost to what you think you are worth. And over time, that does start getting accumulated. I feel organizations, ideally, if they're not nonprofits, should not even have the option to have unpaid internships, for example. If there are organizations out there that are giving you opportunities where you may not be earning as much, I would say do your due diligence and make sure that you will learn what you need to learn. You need to keep the leadership accountable for your learning, regardless of whether you're earning or not. So I would say, again, but if you were to put a gun to my head, I would say learn with a massive asterisk on it. So that's my answer.
Thank you for that.
Can I just add one thing, DJ? I'm sorry, I know I'm messing up the process, but that's sort of my thing. This idea of earning, I think we kind of channeled our answer to financial. And yes, I mean, that's literally what we often think about with earning, but there's so much that can be gained that you can't put a price on. I mean, just in terms of the lessons of experience, like Center for Creative Leadership talks about that. They did this lifelong study about the lessons from senior executives. And I learned that when I first joined the career, and I'm a lot older than most of you. And I've never forgotten those, like lessons from failure, lessons from a turnaround, lessons from, learning from people who've gone on before you that are so valuable. And it's learning, and you're earning, you put it to use later in your life, and it adds value. And so we often think about this sort of financial aspects of earning. And I think in my own career, and this is, I obviously went corporate, and there's other things you can do where you don't make a lot of money. But I will tell you, just because I'm a learner and the Strengths Finder, that is like my number one is learner. And I just followed my passions around what was exciting me about learning, and the rest happened along the way. And many, many, many years later, it hasn't changed. So I think if we think holistically about what earning means and what we're actually gaining, I think it better centers us around making learning a priority.
Thank you so much for that. And now I think we will open it to the floor for some questions. If you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the panel.
We live for questions, you guys.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. My name is Angelina. I'm an MA student at the TC, and I'm also in All Network. So thank you for your time tonight. Definitely everything you said has personally resonated, and I couldn't agree more with all of you. One question I actually had was that, tonight we heard a lot about, the Great Resignation and the labor shortage, especially in the media sector. So can you please share your perspective on how this phenomenon is impacting your work? And this goes sort of to all of you.
Well, I'll go first, since Erin has been going first the whole entire night. We might as well give her a break, right? I am seeing this impacting our work, in that I'm now in these unique scenarios where we've done all the due diligence, we've gotten all the buy-in, we've gotten agreements. Yes, we're going to do this funding, and we're going to fund XYZ LMNOP. And we finally pull the trigger, and we're like, perfect. Now nobody's applying to the job. Mm-hmm. And we don't know what to do. And so my answer to you is, I'm not entirely sure yet we know what the answer is going to be. Because, for example, in a certain project, we've got maybe about 22 open headcount positions where we're trying to fill a specific piece of the industry where maybe people know it's not going to be the best job. It's definitely going to be a scenario where you're learning, not earning, and people just aren't for it anymore. And it just was not something we had ever anticipated. So that's how it's affecting something I'm working on.
I think that's such a great question, Angelina, I'm seeing similar things that Erwin's seeing, but I also think there's some things that are very situational. Like we have a labor shortage in areas that's purely pandemic related. But prior to the pandemic, we're having labor shortage. And I think Erwin alluded that to in the tech world, because I think that for certain types of jobs, the big tech opens up opportunities for people in that, we're coming from non-traditional places like the government, like other sectors where people could begin to move across sectors. So I think we're seeing this in very different ways. Healthcare is experiencing a certain kind of labor shortage. The digital world, digital marketing is and I think we have to look at it holistically around really what's happening. Like we are going through, and we're overusing the word maybe transformation, but this is a massive restructuring that's at the societal level, the culture level. It's global. It was happening before the pandemic, and the pandemic, I think, has really served to accelerate and put focus on it. But I think it's exciting, as scary as it is, because we have an opportunity and we have an advantage in the TC world, right? Because we're learners and we believe in reskilling and upskilling. Part of my passion for leaving the corporate world the way I was and to do this is I'm very concerned about young people that are in college today who are going to be taking jobs that don't exist yet because they're going to be AI driven or machine learning driven. And if you read all the World Economic Forum reports, if you believe any or all of that, we have people making career choices today or training for things that they're not going to be useful in the future. Then you have this older people who are, and when I say older, it's all relative, right? But even people in their middle age or middle career who were super educated and have incredible credentials, and they're going to be out of work completely. Because in the back rooms of, I'm going to just use some examples hypothetically, but the big banks, we had tons of people in certain areas. We're seeing, and all the analysts are saying that we're going to have actually a net increase of jobs, and we're feeling the shortage, but there's a redistribution of where those jobs are. So you'll have a whole list of jobs at Microsoft, and there's a net increase in what they want to provide, and they're also letting all these people go because they don't have the skills and they're not focusing on reskilling and upskilling. So I think this redistribution, this restructuring is both issues and opportunities. And I think we as educators and leaders have an opportunity to help address this issue in a very upfront way. But right now, businesses, government institutions, and educational institutions are failing in terms of addressing the structural changes that are taking place.
Yeah, I'll build. Go on, Erin. Sorry, I'll build on what some of what Cheryl was saying. I definitely agree with your point about how this is it's a bigger systemic thing. I think the media presents it often like it's just this thing that turned on now, and then we're going to turn that valve off, and then we won't have the Great Resignation anymore. But I think it's been sort of gradual all the time that we've been doing quote unquote change in organizations, which has kind of officially been 25 years or so. It's obviously been much longer if you really look at iterations. But there was a core assumption that I noticed was often made by organizations when they were working on transformation programs, certainly the ones that I worked deeply on. There was almost always, if not always, some element of this, and often it was much more widespread, that the people we have are somewhat inadequate somehow, and that there are these better people out there, and we're going to attract and develop and retain those better people. So one of my old bosses used to call it a buy versus build culture. Like, we're going to go buy this great new talent. And that's a separate department, by the way, than the departments that build the internal talent. And now at the end, and I've often over the years been saying, so somebody find me the exact stat on that. I want to quote that stat about how, if you have all these accountants, I worked on a finance transformation, right? A 5,000 person finance transformation. It's not possible that 4,000 or 2,000 or whatever the number is that you say don't have they're not going to be able to close the gap. that we're going to go find all those people to fill that transformation and do the same thing at every other bank and every other industry. And so we have no choice but to be a bit more human about it, because we are all going through this and it's a learning curve for all of us. We all have gaps, but let's look at how we help people bring. So if I'm an accountant with 20th century skills, so to call them, or even 2015 skills, how do I bring them in a different way? What does that look like? How do I interact differently? That's different in the pandemic than it was in person. When we were meeting in person, it would have been more important to wear a suit. Now you just have to dress well on the top, like from here up, right? So there's a lot of changes out there, and it's helping people find themselves in that and believing that people have potential. Because if they don't, there's not some other planet that we're going to get these people from, right? These are the human beings that we have, and we are changing in the workplace. Also, I'm looking at working with an organization that's redesigning their business, undergraduate program. And so that's a chance to really start at, how do we help shift that early? We could do this in early education. We can do this in kindergarten, back to the book. So there is things that a lot of that needs to change, and just taking a more human approach, I think, is the most important part.
Great points.
Yeah, just to really quickly build on that, it seems like the great resignation, as what we want to call them, it seems like it's shifting the power dynamic from organizations having the power to people having the power. And this is one of the few times when we see that massive shift, right? So now job applicants, let's call them, or potential applicants, have much more power over where they want to go, what they want to choose. And most people, as we see, are okay, even if they don't have choices. We are seeing so many stats around. People are willing to let go of job security if it also does not come with well-being along with it, for example. So what the Great Resignation has done has, as folks were mentioning earlier, accelerated a big, important reality check for organizations that well-being is not optional. It's table stakes. And you have to look after your people, otherwise people will leave. It does the financials don't matter as much anymore. You can't pay people more money to stay if it comes at the cost of well-being. So that I am seeing organizations starting to acknowledge and accept that and say, okay, we have to be more human as organizations. We cannot focus on just the employee experience. There's a really interesting article in Forbes about shifting from employee experience to human experience. You need to start, as the world moves from 3D to 2D, the focus moves from the 2D of employee experience to the 3D of human experience. Now organizations have seen inside people's houses. They've understood what kind of personal challenges people go through, their family challenges. The pandemic has kind of opened everything up. So everyone knows everything now. So managers now cannot pretend to not know that their employees are going through a hard time at their houses. So, like all of that human element has become critical. So how I'm seeing that shift is organizations putting a lot more focus and a lot more investment, many different kinds of investments into well-being for people, into the flexibility, self-care of people. And at the same time, it requires managers to level up really quickly and really massively in terms of how they need to empathize and support their people in dimensions that they didn't have to before. So that's also like a really big implication, is that shift of what does leadership need to learn now to be able to manage their people well. So again, if you see most of the Great Resignation stats, it's either because people are leaving because of well-being or their managers. And like both of those pieces have huge implications on how organizations plan forward. So just building on everything else that was already said.
Thank you, Angelina, for that question. And thank you, panel, for those very insightful answers.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I just wanted to add one quick thing. Thank you guys for answering. It's just I come from the legal industry, so I just wanted to also add that everything is very applicable in our industry as well. And our COO actually recently joined from PwC, and he literally said, "How do we make learning sexy for people?" and that's really now our new mission, is to sort of like, Cheryl, to your point, like increase AI capabilities and things like that, because we realize that people are no longer sort of interested in that aspect in the workplace. So DJ, thanks for your time. But yeah, I appreciate everybody's responses.
Sure. Are there other questions?
I do have a question. This is Anna. It might be a big question though. So in terms of an organization, when there's red tapes that an organization have to go through, how would a leader ensure like the momentum of change is still there when there's so many hoops and hurdles that the leader would have to take the team across with? So I guess the first question is, how would the leader make sure like the team is motivated, but also the stakeholders are motivated as well to go through the multiple hoops and hurdles to ensure the change that they're trying to achieve?
So this is a great question. In this example, is there momentum there? Like, is this a specific example?
I mean, there might be like an initial like momentum, like excitement about the change, but then when there's so much red tape going on, I'm curious about how that leader would ensure the momentum of change is still like there.
Yeah, because I think I heard you say it first to kind of make people feel it. And I think the elephant in the room is sometimes there isn't the momentum there. Because sometimes there's oh yeah, we're going to do this thing. It's really important, but we don't have any money right now, or we don't have any time right now, or there's a pandemic right now. And then of course it's hard for a leader to tell their team there's lots of momentum because there's actually not. So when there's not, I think it's okay to be honest about that and to say that it's still important, but it's on pause because of these things. And then it's a shift in focus instead of waiting. We don't want to train people, I think, in 21st century skills to be waiting. We want to train them to be thinking about how do we use this time to prepare ourselves for that unknown, getting yourself sort of psychologically ready. What kind of self-management sort of stuff can you do? I don't know, because I do see this a lot where there is something put out there, people get excited, but there isn't actually momentum. And if there's not, let's not try to pretend there is. You can keep communicating every month that it's still on our minds and it was on the board discussion or whatever the case may be. But I think people are smart and they're going to suss it out if you're pretending that it's moving faster or is about to come if it's really not.
I think Erin's point is so good about momentum. Thank you. That actually helped me with something, Erin. So thank you for that insight. And I would say, Anna, that I think understanding what red tape is for your organization, if you're the leader or if you're part of the team, is really important, because a big part of a leader's job is to figure out what is in my control and what's not in my control. And of the things that are in my control or not in my control, how do I help communicate that to the team so that they know how we're working together? So specifically, when I was moving up in an organization, when I left MasterCard, now I'm part of a very small organization and I manage a few people. But when at my peak at MasterCard, I had a global team with 300 people in it, and I still encountered red tape. But red tape could look like, as Erin said, we don't have the budget. So that's not necessarily red tape. That's just a hard reality. Red tape could look like corporate politics. Red tape could look like there's no alignment in terms of the strategy or the vision or confidence. Red tape could look like a process that could be circumvented. And so as a leader, you kind of have to really suss out what's really the root of the resistance or the challenges that we're facing. And what can I do as a leader to help clear the pathway? Because that's your job as a leader. So for example, so I used to confuse, when I was moving up in the organization, politics with influence management. I got to say, oh, wait a minute. I used to attribute everything to politics of the organization or personalities. But actually, as leaders, we have to grow in our ability to influence change and convince other people. And so if the red tape is lack of alignment, as a leader, I can do something about that. Who do I need to talk to? What are their objections? How do we, connect with that? So dimensionalizing the limitations and working together as a team or with your peers or with your boss as a coach or with a mentor, really processing like, how can we how can we get this moving? How can we keep the momentum is super important. Because a lot of times if you're in the middle of an organization, or even if you're senior in an organization, you're feeling a lot of headwinds, it can feel very demoralizing. But, there are things we can do to change and move. And that's when it starts to get exciting. That's when you start moving from management to leadership, in your ability to remove obstacles for your team and for yourself. You can do it.
Thank you so much for that, Cheryl. I know we're getting short on time, so I want to end with a quick question for all the panelists. And it is, in 10 words or less, what is one piece of advice that you'd leave this group with?
I'm going to go so no one can steal mine. And it's going to be always be willing to learn.
Great one. Thank you for that.
I would say scan your environment, your industry, the workplace, the opportunities, identify the wave that's coming, swim out to it and ride the wave.
Thank you.
I think staying open, curious, open, if it's a chance to take a job far away or another industry, just keep that sense of openness and awe about things.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. I feel for me as well, it was similar, like show up to opportunities, show up to places, and look after yourself. Self-care is really, really underrated. So make sure you're looking after yourself while you're doing all of that.
Awesome. Thank you all. I know we are at 8:30, we're at time, but I just want to thank you again for being here and so generously offering your time to us. We appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who attended. It was a great event. So have a good night, all.
You too.
Bye.
Let's stay in touch. So many of you had fascinating things to say. I want to talk to all of you more over coffee or wine.